I'm Tasneem Essop, and this is episode 7 of Just Access, The Real Transition, a podcast from PARI, the Public Affairs Research Institute. Visions of justice sit more comfortably in policy papers than are implemented in practice. But scattered across South Africa are small experiments that show what more inclusive governance might one day become. This episode asks, how do we shift from policy promises to practical collaboration? Through the work of researchers and local partners, we explore how accountability, co-production, and community-driven planning can start to close the gap between intention and impact. We are joined by PARI researcher Dr Tracy Ledger, whom we spoke to in episodes 1 and 2, to unpack why real justice begins long before the meeting, when communities help define the problem itself. Tracy, in your work, you speak to problems of how public participation is both conceived and implemented in relation here specifically to the just energy transition. And you describe this idea of co-production. What is co-production and how is it different from public participation?
So if we talk about the problems associated with public participation, so almost all countries in all parts of different kinds of policy have this idea of public participation or public consultation. But there's a very specific role that is conceptualized for the public in policymaking. So the way in which it works in South Africa is a good example of how it works in many countries. So the state has a problem it wants to solve. Policymaking is fundamentally about problem solving, whether that problem is creating jobs, growing the economy, reducing child mortality. There's a problem that the state wants to solve. So what happens 99% of the time is that the policy that responds to that problem is designed by people inside the state, often with a lot of so-called experts from outside come and help and design the policy. And then when the policy is completed, whether that is a particular policy, whether it's something like an IDP, then there's this public consultation part. And normally what that comprises is the state goes off and does a very lengthy PowerPoint presentation to the community, and then the community gets a couple of minutes to ask questions. And even if people violently object to things, there aren't normally many changes that are made. And then we say, well, we did public consultation, and that's the end of the discussion. So there are multiple reasons why that is actually a very poor way of including public participation in policymaking. And the most obvious one is that you want people to buy into a policy and to believe that the policy is valid and useful and applicable, because that helps with the acceptance of the policy. But that is actually the smallest reason why you need public participation. It's obviously a part of democratic processes, and that is important, but there are other just as important reasons why you want more public participation. So let's go back to this idea that policymaking is about problem solving. You can only do good problem solving, that is, maximize the possibility that your policy is actually going to fix the problem, if you've got a really good idea of the problem. What drives the problem? What are the main contributing factors? And the bottom line is that very often people within the state and outside experts have a very poor idea of what the problem is. It's the people who are living that problem who have the insights into the problem. So when you don't get these communities involved right at the beginning of your problem definition process, there's a really good chance that you're going to miss what the issue is and have a policy that doesn't meet actual requirements. A good example of that is child nutrition in South Africa. So we have very poor rates of child nutrition, and this is obviously seen as a problem by the state. And one of the programs or policies that has been designed to address that is this educating people about what they should feed their children. And in fact, that's a big part of the child anti-malnutrition strategies. And this program has been running for years and years and years. And it has had absolutely no impact on the problem, in large part because that's not the problem. The problem is not that people don't know what to feed their children, it's that they can't afford to buy the food that they need to feed their children. But because no one who is food insecure is actually included in making this policy, this problem remains invisible. So that is one of the reasons why you need to have what is called co-production, which means that you involve impacted communities right at the beginning of the policymaking process, not at the end of the policymaking process. And in reference to the energy transition, especially in Mpumalanga, where the focus is to make sure that coal impacted communities are going to be impacted as little as possible by the coal shutdown, there are all these policies and programs that have been developed to try and ameliorate the impact of the coal shutdown. But they are also following the same model of public participation, which is with consulting with people at the end. So then communities will say, yeah, but your policy's got nothing to do with the things that are most important for us. So that has led to a lot of contestation in these communities about whether or not the just transition is actually just.
Sure. And I mean, I think so much of what public participation has become is this kind of tick box exercise, right? It's something you have to do.
Malicious compliance.
Sure. And I think what's so important about what you're saying is that people are the experts of their own lives and experiences, right? So instead of bringing in these so called experts, let's bring the people who this impacts the most. There's this line in South Africa that's often repeated: we have good policies and poor implementation. How would you respond to this idea?
I think it's an astonishingly stupid thing to say, because if the policies are so great, then why can't they be implemented? One of the basics when you design a policy is you've got to design it for your local context. You've got to design it to be implemented, which means you have to take into account in advance how you're going to implement the policy. So if you've designed this supposedly wonderful policy, but it can't be implemented, it can't be a wonderful policy because you haven't thought about the implementation part. It's like saying, oh, I've designed this fantastic house, but I can't build it because the technology to build it doesn't exist. So this is the thing, is that if they really were good policies, they'd be implemented because we would have considered the barriers to implementation when we designed the policy.
Sure. And I mean, policy has to fit, it has to work in its context, in the areas that it's supposed to work in. And if it's not doing that, then it's just good on paper, right? That's not really a good policy and bad implementation. That's then bad policy. Right?
Exactly. And this is a lot of what this so-called international best practice from other countries. That is then, we say because, well, Singapore did that, or South Korea did that, or Germany did that, then we're going to replicate it here. Whereas the fact that it worked in a context like Germany, for example, has got absolutely nothing to do with whether or not it is going to work in a country like South Africa. And even then, if something works in one part of the country, in one context, there's absolutely no reason to assume that it will automatically work in a different part of the country in another context. So co-production is also very much about addressing that issue of local context, because it makes sure that you are actually taking local context into account when you design a policy, which then should include potential barriers to implementation.
Sure. And given this, and at least from the outside, it seems that the kind of just energy transition is a really complex thing, right? From a policy perspective, it's broad. There's multiple stakeholders from unions, communities, business, government. I mean, those are just listing a few, but there's so many moving parts here. How do you do policy work that's both broad at the level of the just energy transition, but also driven locally and locally appropriate?
So that is the challenge. You think, all right, if I want to have co-production of policy that impacts the energy transition in Mpumalanga, does that mean that every single person who lives in Mpumalanga has got to be in the room to discuss the issue, which is obviously not doable? And it's also about then looking at what is the problem that you're trying to solve. So what we have seen is that as people have realized that the current public participation processes are not really working, what they're doing is trying to sort of double down on that. So it's saying, okay, instead of having like 2 PowerPoint presentations, we'll have 10 PowerPoint presentations. Instead of having 2 community engagements, we'll have 5 community engagements. But that is missing the point. That is simply scaling up the existing process without saying what we need to do is revise the current process. And mostly what we need is we need to have the input of the community much earlier in the policy making process. So when we're deciding what the problem is to solve. So for example, saying, well, the most important problem we've got to solve in Mpumalanga is people who are currently working in coal who are going to lose their jobs. Yes, that is a problem. But if you go into communities, there are actually many other very serious problems that people are facing as a result of the coal shutdown. So, what we've realized in our research is that lots and lots of people in communities said to us, we haven't been consulted. And then organizations like the PCC would be quite frustrated with our analysis and say, but we've been in that community so many times. How can people say they haven't been consulted? And what we realized is that when people said we haven't been consulted, they didn't always mean we weren't in a meeting. Sometimes they weren't in a meeting, but a lot of times they were. But that's not what they meant. What they meant when they said we haven't been consulted is they mean we haven't been heard. We haven't had the reality of our lives turned into the plan. So we were in the meeting and we saw your plan, but your plan has got nothing to do with our lives. So when we started to think about it from that perspective, then we realized that the point is not having every single person in the room during the public participation process. It's about expanding what we think of as evidence to inform the policy. So this is one of the things that we realized is that the policies around the jet were being made very much around official data sets about numbers of formal businesses in the coal sector, number of formal employees in the coal sector, and a very limited other sort of data. But that there were all sorts of other things that were important to people that were not being captured because they were not in these official data sets. So, for example, what was not being captured? Well, there were all of the people who were contract workers in Eskom power stations who consider themselves employees of Eskom, but in the official data, they're not employees of Eskom. There are all the people who work in the informal sector tied to the coal sector, whether that's women selling food on the side of the road or people renting out back rooms that were not taken into account. There was all of the social infrastructure in communities that's dependent on the coal sector, like schools, aftercare centers, ECD centers. And then there were all of the services that are actually provided by the coal sector and Eskom to communities, from community playing fields, community centers, domestic violence centers, support for communities. And all of these things were really important to communities and were going to have an incredible impact on their lives when they were lost, but they were not visible to policymakers. So what we realized is that an important part of facilitating co-production was, in fact, to broaden this base of information that policymakers are using to make policies around the just transition, as opposed to just having everybody in the room after the fact.
Sure. It's so powerful what you're saying is that it's not visible to policymakers. I think that's an important way of explaining why co-production is important, because if you bring people into the process, it's likely that they will talk about, them selling food on the side of the road, or their little business, or their backroom situation, or how they access facilities that are actually provided by Eskom or the coal mine. And I think that's a really useful way of thinking about why co-production is so important. We spoke in a different episode about access to basic services, and the free basic service package. Your research has shown that, as you've just suggested around ECD centers and so on, that basic services like water and electricity are also being provided to mining affected communities or communities close to coal mines and Eskom power stations, that they are the ones providing the basic services. So how does the transition away from coal impact them in more significant ways as these power stations are closed down? And what are the kind of gaps around planning in this?
There are very big gaps in the planning around those services, in that there's basically no planning around those services. So where coal mines and Eskom power stations are, for example, providing water to local communities, there's no real plan for who's going to take over that water provision. The center of the energy transition is a Malahleni local municipality, which is deeply dysfunctional, particularly in respect of the supply of water. But there are other social goods that are being supplied by the coal industry and by coal-fired power stations that are very important to communities. So if we have a look at a wide range of things, whether it's the local community centers, there are rape crisis centers, a significant percentage of all of the technical engineering bursaries that go to people in Mpumalanga come from Eskom or come from coal mines. A lot of support to local schools and clinics and ECD centers comes from the mines and from Eskom. Community members will say to you, if we need something in the community, something's broken, it's pointless going to ask the local municipality. We go and ask the coal mine and they come and help with it. Then there's the more formal way in which these mines are helping. So mines have to, by law in South Africa, as part of their SLP, they provide support to local municipalities. In Malahleni local municipality, there's almost no municipal service that is not supported by the local coal mines, whether that is fixing roads, supplying water, basic infrastructure. So there's been no thinking about what happens when all of those coal mines close down, and all of that indirect support, either that goes to the municipality or the direct support that goes to communities, then disappears. Education opportunities, university opportunities, all of those things just disappear.
Tracy shows us what inclusion should look like in theory, why participation fails when it comes too late, and why co-production matters if policy is meant to respond to real lives rather than abstract problems. But understanding the principle is only the first step. The harder question is what happens when you try to build this kind of inclusion day to day, inside institutions shaped by hierarchy, compliance, and limited capacity. In the next episode, we turn to what co-production looks like in practice inside local government, where accountability isn't a concept, but a relationship that has been rebuilt meeting by meeting. I'm Tasneem Essop, and you're listening to Just Access, The Real Transition, a podcast from PARI, the Public Affairs Research Institute. If you want to learn more about PARI and their research, go to www.pari.org. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and keep listening.